Thanks, Stephen, for the comment. Hello, everyone. So, maybe Stephen, I try to share from my side first. The intro side.
I can see, and it looks clear.
Oh, cool.
It's 720p, so it looks.
Yeah, thank you, Marvin. Wherever we are live. Thank you. Hmm. Uh, Stephen, can I take over for a few minutes?
Of course.
Okay. Share application window. Yeah. There's a problem. Problem. Okay, let me see again. How do I share screen? Share application window, and here we go. Start sharing. So, uh, okay, seems good. I think Marvin need to hide the sidebar. Thank you. Uh, Hello everyone. Sorry for the trouble a bit. Because today I was supposedly trying a new thing uh, regarding never mind, later I talk. Okay, so welcome to our meetup today. Thanks for tuning in. So today is the second session from Stephen.
Hi, everybody.
I, okay, so how do I go to next slide? I'm using Mac, by the way. Never mind. I hope you don't mind if I go like this. So I'm Chun Lin. So I think no need to introduce myself too much. And welcome to our meetup. And if you would like to join us as our sharing, because we need sharing more speakers for the coming months. So if you would like to volunteer yourself, please let us know. Just contact us. Go to our meetup.com/AzureSG and you can find for us Riza, uh, Marvin, me, and Priyanka. So yes, this is what I'm trying to do. Resolution. So last week, there are people saying that resolution is too low, so the screen is very blurred. So I try to just now. I was trying with Visa actually to change to 720p, but it doesn't work well. So thanks Marvin for helping me also. Thank you. So now it's hosting by Marvin. Thank you. Uh, uh, so it's same thing. So we have different types of meetup. So currently, because due to the COVID situation, so we can't only do the online, which is the YouTube. So if you next time, hopefully we can continue our face-to-face meetup at the Microsoft Office. So if you would like to share, not in types of, not in form of online sharing, you can also join our open source projects where you can share with us your personal interesting projects which is related to .NET or Azure. And the GitHub link for our communities over here is github.com/sg-.net. Finally, please help to subscribe to our channel because I need 1,000 views to do a community sharing. Currently, we only have nearly 200. This is not our channel. Screenshot from somewhere else. So hopefully one day we can reach here. And feel free to ask your question in the live chat, which is at the side if you view it on your PC, or at the bottom if you view it on your mobile. So Stephen, well, same as last week, he will answer our questions over here. And yeah, so last week we talked about these two topics. And I think today Stephen will start with part of the topic remaining from last week. And then we will proceed to the third and fourth, which is about the DevOps. And yeah, let's begin. So I hand it over to Stephen. Sorry again for the technical issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chun Lin.
Thank you. Stop sharing. How do I
Let's begin. Are you switching over to my sharing? Is my screen being presented, or what, how does this work? Oh, I need to present my screen again. Sorry, I just realized. Okay, let me know when you can see my screen. Okay, good evening, everybody. While I'm waiting for my screen to show up, and I can see it's shown up now. So let's begin. So for those of you who have attended the last session that was held last week, the same time as today, we did go through the first initial two topics on Azure governance and Azure networking as the first topic. And we went through the high availability options for VMs as the second topic that we went through. So while we ended off with a demo on how high availability and networking can be integrated together, I didn't quite go through, right, the how do you filter network traffic and what are the options that you have. So before I move on to today's session on Azure DevOps and how to manage Visual Studio Code, which will primarily be a demo-focused session rather than going through theory, which means I'll be presenting a lot on my Azure portal. So that's the reason why I asked Marvin and Chun Lin for the 720p resolution, if not 1080p, but I think we can manage with 720p. Okay, so let's start with Azure Network Filtering. Right. So there are really two mainstream methods that you can use for Azure Network Filtering. And I think the first one, for those of you who are infrastructure professionals, you will know this as Network Security Group. And Network Security Group, right, is a managed service based on Azure. It's essentially, to the layman, just an ACL, or access control list. So how that works is you basically have a set of rules, and every rule has a corresponding priority number to it. And the lower that number, the higher the significance or the importance. So I will show you some demonstrations on NSG, but otherwise you can just know it at this point as an ACL, access control list. Okay. The second option is to have some kind of firewall, right? This can be third party like Checkpoint and Barracuda and so on. For Azure, we have an Azure firewall. So this firewall, we refer to it as next gen. And the one key thing that Azure Firewall or any next gen firewalls have over the network security group option is this includes the option for you to do FQDM based traffic filtering, right? So if I take a look at the network security groups, right, it's going to be mainly a set of rules on IP addresses. So for inbound and outbound traffic, what are the IP address segments that are allowed? What are the ports that are allowed? And what are the corresponding IP segments that I deny versus the ports that I deny, right? So let's jump straight into a demo. And I'll show you, depending on which model that you choose, right, your design philosophy of your network topology will be different. Okay, so first, let me show you a network security group. So it does look like I can see things pretty clearly. So that should reflect well on the YouTube side, because I'm looking at the YouTube window to my left, and it's kind of a few seconds behind. So I'll monitor that. Okay. So here you are able to see a list of network security groups that I have. Let me draw it down to just one subscription so that we are clearer. So first, let me introduce a bit of my environment. I have two virtual networks. Ignore the OpenVPN network. So I have an infra network prod and the infra network UAT. And if I go into the infra network prod, and if I look at my address space, that's 10.20.0.0/16. We talked about this last week. So this is essentially the IP range that I have to work with, 10.20.0.0 to 10.20.255.255. Right. So if I go into subnets, you're able to see that I have 4 subnets: management, app, web, and data. So by default, if you don't associate any network security group with the virtual, so all the subnets within the virtual network, all inbound and outbound traffic by default are allowed, right? So if you create a VM and put it into one of these subnets, all ports are open. So if that VM has a corresponding public IP address, then all the ports like 3389, 22, 3306, 80, 443, 123, 7474, and everything like that, those are all open to the wide internet, right? So obviously, from a network parameter-based security, that is not ideal. That is why we are now talking about network security group. And let's take a look at how they can filter the traffic. All right. So so first and foremost, a bit more on the theory. So for NSGs, they can be associated with 2 types of resources on Azure. Right? The first type being network interface cards. And the second type being subnets. So if you have a VM whose network interface card sits within the web subnet, which sits within global VNet, like a virtual network, right? You can associate this NSG. You can associate at either here. You can have an NSG, or you can have an NSG here. So this is looking at an individual VM view. But if I draw a network diagram, so let's take this as a VNet. So let's call this VNet global, VNet. And within this VNet, let's say there are 2 subnets, right? Say this is subnet 1, and this is subnet 2. So let's say you have a VM that is hosted on, or have one network interface card, which is in subnet 1, and another VM that is in subnet 2, right? So let's say you have 2 VMs here and 2 VMs here, okay? So let's call it VM1, VM2, VM3, VM4. All right. So when you create a network security group, you can, number 1, associate it with this subnet. Okay. So let's say this is NSG1. And if you create another subnet, another NSG, let's call this NSG2, you can associate with this second subnet, right? You can also associate one NSG into many subnets and many virtual network interface cards. So you don't absolutely have to create one NSG per subnet or per network interface card. Many resources, many subnets and network interfaces can share the same NSG, so long as they are within the same region, right? So this is the recommended way of governing your NSGs. So NSGs, when they are applied to the subnet, the rules are applicable to all of the network interface cards that are joined to this subnet. And any traffic that are going through the network interfaces within that subnet will have to obey the rules of the NSG. Now, if you use the second, so I was talking about the second method, so that's this method. Now, let's switch gears to look at the first method of associating NSGs with network interfaces. Then you can technically create an NSG, associate with the network interface card of VM1. You can create another NSG and associate with the network interface card of VM2. And these two NSGs can be two different NSGs. So what I mean is they can have different rules. Maybe for VM1, you will open port 80 and 443, but deny 3389. And for VM2, you will open 3306 or 1433, and maybe you also want to deny 3389, right? So the use case is heavily dependent on, or the way that you execute this is heavily dependent on your business requirements or non-functional requirements. So as a rule of thumb at Microsoft, we don't recommend you to create NSGs and associate them at the VM level. I mean, there can be exceptions that you want to do that, but those should be exceptions and not the norm. Because if you start associating NSGs to the network interface cards, very soon you will lose track of all the rules that you are creating, and therefore network traffic can be a huge pain to govern in your environment. So the advice that we give and the best practice is always to associate rules to NSGs at a subnet level, and you absolutely cannot create an NSG and then associate to the VNet. This is not possible, right? So if anyone asks whether you can associate NSG to a virtual network, the answer is yes, but not directly. You need to associate the same NSG to all the subnets within the VNet, and then you achieve the effect of having the same set of access control list rules, and that's going to govern the whole VNet. Okay. Now, let's take a look at any one of these NSGs. So how can we tell what NSGs are being applied to a subnet? So if I take a look at these virtual network, there is no such thing as NSG at the left. There's only Firewall, which is a separate topic, or the second topic that I will talk about. But at this point, there is no NSG here. Why? Because NSGs can only be associated either at the at the VNIC level, network interface level, or the subnet level. So if I go into the subnets, and if I go into any one of these subnets, so if I go into management, you can see that under network security group, the network security group that is being applied is this NSG management network security group. And if you click the drop down, you can choose any one of the other NSGs that you have created within the same region, or you can choose none, and no NSGs will be associated with this subnet. So here, let me show you from an NSG perspective how that looks like. So remember on this screen, in the management subnet, NSG-management is the NSG that is being applied at this subnet level. So if I go into this NSG, and I go into NSG management, you can see that I have a set of inbound and outbound rules, right? For anything above priority number 4096, anything above that number, those are all system created rules. System created rules cannot be deleted and they cannot be edited, but you can override them with your own rules at a lesser priority value, which means, let's say here is a rule at 65,500. It says deny all inbound, right? You can either partially or fully override this rule, right? If you create a rule that says allow all inbound, you can reserve the same settings. So for port, that's any port, any protocol, any source, any destination, but the action you can put it as allow. And if you create a rule and the eligible values are between 100 to 4096 in priority, you effectively override this rule. Okay? So if you disagree with any one of these system created rules, you can override them, but you cannot delete or edit them, right? So if I look at inbound security rules, and if you click add, right? So you can see the views are quite self-explanatory if you are doing Azure infrastructure, but if you're not, the the fields go like that, right? Essentially, you want to define what is the source. Is the source anything, like anything on the World Wide Web, anything from local intranet, or are you only applying this set of rules to a specific subset of IP addresses, service tags, or application security groups? So I wouldn't go into in-depth detail, but if you can leave a comment and we can discuss this in a more private situation. But I'll just go through IP addresses. Application security group is something that has to do with a logical grouping of different VM resources that you can put in the same NSG, and they may not belong to the same subnet. A service tag is when you have Azure resources, and if you choose service tag, that can be internet, virtual network, it depends on the kind of resource. But I won't go into deep detail here because the focus of today's session is supposed to be Azure DevOps, and so I'll try to wrap the session up. So if I choose IP addresses, then I can define the source IP. The source IP can be either a public IP address, which means it's a globally routable IP address, or it can be an intranet or private IP address, like 10.x or 192.168.something.something, right? So when you set this rule, right, if you define the source, then that rule only applies to that source, right? So the destination, you can choose any, and if you apply the NSG at a subnet level, so if you apply this NSG to subnet 1, then even though you chose any, the effective scope of this rule is just all the network interfaces in that subnet, right? Which is different from the default understanding that it will apply to anything. So if you choose any, and if you choose to associate this NSG to subnet 1, maybe you have a different virtual network, right? You may have a second virtual network with a subnet here. Let's call it subnet 3. And you associate NSG1 with also subnet 3, then the rules stated and defined within NSG1 will apply to all the network interfaces within subnet 1 and subnet 3, right? So when you choose the destination, you also get to choose the port range. So let's say if I'm trying to enable a web port, so port 80, then I would put in port 80 as the defined port range. You can put a comma and put in different values. So port 80 and 443. You can also put a range like 7474 to 8484. So that's also possible, right? So you can have comma delimited values. You can also have ranges. And for protocol, you can choose any one of the three or all of them, right? TCP, UDP, ICMP. By default, ICMP is disabled on Azure. And if you have, so you can't rely on ping. When you try to ping two different nodes on Azure, you should not expect that to succeed because ICMP is by default disabled as a protocol. Okay. And very importantly, you need to choose what's the action. Is it to allow or is it to deny? If you choose to allow, then that traffic is going to be allowed, or if you choose to deny, then that traffic is going to be denied. And then you put in a value, and this value, you have to be very careful the values that you put, right? If you put this below another rule, like if 1010 is below 1000. So if you put 1010, that rule is going to be superseded by rule 1000. If you want this rule to supersede all other rules, you can put it as 100, which is the minimum value. So you can't put 99, for example, because the value has to be between 100 and 4096, as I was mentioning earlier. So once you put, so as a best practice, we don't advise you to use 100. We also don't advise you to use 4096 because those are the two extremes. And if you want to temporarily override this value or this rule, you can't simply create another rule to override it. And we recommend that you at least keep 10 spaces between rules. So if let's say your first rule is 1000, your next rule can be 1010, and then the next one is 1020, and so on, right? Because if you don't leave a gap and say if your first rule is 100, your next rule is 101, your next rule is 102, that can create a problem if you need to create a rule that slips in between two rules, right? So I'm not going to go through with this wizard, but so what you can also name the rule and just press add. So what I'm going to show you here, though, is I'm going to show you this rule that I have, right? It's called allow SSH and RDP, and for good reason. I allow the access of ports 22, which is for SSH, and 3389, which is for RDP. And I only allow traffic from this IP address. What is this IP address? So if I just do a search, right, what is my IP? And you can see this is my current public IP address. And so if you look at this value, what I'm really trying to, the rule that I'm trying to state here is I do allow RDP traffic, okay? So this is built on top of deny all. So if I don't put this rule, by default, all inbound connections are denied. But if I put this rule, then I am allowing RDP and SSH traffic into the subnets and the network interfaces that I applied this NSG towards. But I only allow that traffic to come from my on-premises network IP address. So even if I show you the public IP address of my jump host VMs, you can try to RDP, but your traffic will be blocked. You have to be within my network in order to access the endpoint. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is how NSG works. So let me just give you a quick demonstration. If I go into the subnets, you can see that this NSG is applied to two subnets. They're both called management, but they belong to virtual networks. I think an easier demonstration is I use UAT because I have two VMs there, right? So you can see infra VNet UAT, management, and you can see for NSG web, it's applied to web UAT. This is the same subnet. And if you look at inbound security rules, right, here I deny SSH and RDP ports. So I deny all, right? Why do I need to put this rule? Because there is a rule above the deny all inbound that says allow VNet inbound. So what allow VNet inbound means is all traffic between subnets are routable and they're all open, right? So this rule will supersede the deny all inbound. But what I don't want to have is I don't want to have my database server trying to RDP into my web server or my app server trying to RDP into my database server. So I don't want that to happen. So I have a blanket deny SSH and RDP rule. But above that, I do allow SSH and RDP from my management subnet, which acts as my jump host subnet. Or to those who are managing on-prem, that would be equivalent to your DMZ. No, that's equivalent to your Bastion or DMZ. Yeah, I think DMZ is the right term. Okay, so at this point, let me just show you a quick demonstration. I'm going to show you a VM that is in the web subnet, and I'm also going to show you a VM that is in the management subnet. I'm going to demonstrate to you that from my PC at home, I will be able to access the jump host, but I will not be able to RDP directly into the web VM because the RDP traffic that I allow must come from the management subnet and not from my home PC. So here, let me show you my list of virtual machines. I do have, so UAT VM1, I have a set of public IP, and UAT VM1 here, I have a public IP. So this is my jump host. I'm first going to try to RDP here, then I'm going to try to RDP here. Okay, so I'm just going to go into this VM, copy this IP address, do RDP, and I try to RDP in. Okay, so at this point, I've already hit my RDP endpoint. So I'm just going to key in my username and password. And now you'll see that I'll be able to log into that VM. So if you tried on your end, all of your PCs, right? If you try to RDP to this IP address, you will not be able to do it. Why? Because so if you look at the networking, you will see that under inbound security rules, which is applied at the subnet level, the source IP address that I allow to access the RDP port is only my home IP. And since you're not connecting from my home IP, you will not be able to RDP into this VM. Okay. And so the next VM that I wanted to show you was this VM, where it says that I only allow RDP from 10.20.0.0/24. Now, I can try to copy this public IP, and I can try to RDP in. You'll see that this will time out. Right? This connection will not succeed because the network rule is blocking RDP from this PC. Now, if I try to do the same from the jump host, right, this will also fail. Why? Because when I try to RDP using this public IP, the source IP that I'm connecting from is this VM's public IP address. And this VM's public IP address will obviously not fit within the allowed range, which is 10.20.0.0/24. So the way that I can access this VM is through its private endpoint. And when I connect from the private endpoint, the source will be 10.20.0.4, right? And that is because if I try to do a IP config, you'll see that the private IP address is 10.20.0.4. And so if I try to RDP into 10.20.4.4, you'll see that I'll be able to hit that endpoint and I'll be able to remotely access the VM. So this traffic is being allowed, right? Okay. So this is a quick demonstration of how you can do network filtering through network security groups. Okay. So given this model, right, how would you then design your network? Because for on-prem, you will be very used. Let me check this. Okay. For on-prem, you'll be very used to have, if this is your VLAN, right, on-prem, you will be very used to spinning subnets based on applications. So let's say you have a subnet for HR app, you have a subnet for a finance app, and in those subnets, you will have your web VM, your application server, and your DB server. They will all be in the same subnet. Finance app will be the same, assuming 3-tiered architecture. You will have a collection of web VMs, a collection of app servers, and maybe a collection of DB VMs that are serving the same cluster. So when you have this kind of distribution, that is for on-prem, and this works because all of them are governed by a firewall. Okay. However, within Azure, if you don't employ a firewall, right, and you just employ NSGs, then what happens if you have this kind of setup? When you associate the NSGs at a subnet level, how are you going to define the rules? Because some of your VMs are web, so port 80 has to open. Some of your VMs may be app servers, so they may have a requirement for port 8080 to be open, or 7474 or some custom ports that you are using. And DB might not be open at all, or they might be open depending on your use case, right? So within VM, there needs to be a design change, and this is only applicable if you are using a pure NSG network traffic filtering model. And so if I just create, say if this is your VNet, what you'll wind up doing is you will still have different subnets. So this is going to be your web subnet. This is going to be your app subnet. And you can create multiple different app subnets depending on, so this is the keyword. It depends on the ports that the VMs of this subnet require access to. And this is your data subnet, right? So by default, so let me just draw, this VM will come here and will be your web VM for HR app. So HR web. And this VM, which is a finance app, will also come here to be your HR web. Finance web. Why? Because the port requirement is the same. You can just associate an NSG here that says I allow port 80, I allow port 443. And so the same applies to app and DB, right? So this is app. So this is HR app, finance app. And this is assuming that they use the same ports. And you can, sorry. And once again, you have fin data or DB and HR DB. Okay, so when you have this kind of a setup, can you see that there is a clear difference in how you would design your network topology for on-premises network with a firewall, and how you would design that on Azure with just using NSGs, right? So this port 80 and 443 access can be from internet or from anywhere, right? And here maybe you will have an NSG that says I allow port 8080 and only from web subnet. Here you will have allow ports 1433 and 3306 for the two most popular SQL transactional database technologies. And this would only be from app because in a three-tier architecture, only your app layer should be talking to your database, and your web layer should be communicating with your database through the app logic layer, right? So of course, by default, this subnet is able to directly hit your data subnet, right? The default rules would allow that. This is where, if you use the NSG model, you need to have a rule within the NSG that specifically says, I deny port 1433 and 3306 from anywhere, but I do allow it only from the app subnet. So this, at a high level, or at least at a best practices level, is how you should be designing your virtual networks in context of Azure without the use of firewalls. All right. So as an example, you can see that in this UAT VM, if I go into networking, I do allow HTTP and HTTPS to this destination from any. So that means I can technically access this IP address and I hit an IaaS page. And if you want to try using the same IP address, you will hit the same endpoint. You will hit the same web page, because that is specifically allowed within the rules that I've specified. So that is a quick summary of what NSG is. Let me try to address some of the questions. So Alice was asking, so to open port for VM running Microsoft SQL Server, we will need to open 1433 port in the VM as well as on NSG. Okay, that is a good question. So let me rephrase the question and generalize it. The question is, if I if I have a rule in NSG that says I allow 1433, does that mean that at the OS level, the port is already open? The answer is no, right? It's a very good question. At the OS level, there is so I think you're talking about Windows Defender with Windows Defender Firewall with advanced security. Absolutely, you still have to modify this. If you're using Linux, there is a Linux firewall that you have to manage. And if you turn this on or turn this off, that is separate from NSGs. So there are really two layers. The first layer is the NSG layer, and the next layer is the OS layer. So you have to take care of both. That's a good question. Question on deep learning model, like CO Lab. So if you run a VM, right, you can definitely spin up things like, so you can definitely use applications like Colab. But you need to be very aware whether that application is processor heavy, RAM heavy, or graphics heavy. There are some algorithms that use very exclusively graphics performance. So you would need to spin up a VM with dedicated graphics compute power that allows graphics-based or graphics card-based compute. So CO Lab, I'm not sure what it sounds like. It is. It could be processor or graphics intensive. So for graphics, you want to spin up an NV series VM. And for processor, you want to spin up, I think it's an F series for compute intensive, right? But sure, we should have VMs that are capable of doing that. Okay. Okay, so now let me address. So now I have covered NSGs as an ACL. Let me cover firewall. So for Azure Firewall or any next-gen firewall, the idea is to, as much as possible, replicate what you have in this kind of environment, where any traffic that goes in and out of a particular subnet or even multiple subnets have to go through your Azure Firewall or your Barracuda or Checkpoint or any third-party firewalls that you might use. So I have a demonstration on Azure Firewall that I hope that I can discuss the theory as we go along using a demonstration-based approach. So here, if I go into firewalls, that gave me a scare, but I see that I'm scoped to the wrong subscription. So you see that I have a demo firewall here, right? So this firewall is currently turned on. And if I go into the public IP configuration, you will see that I have 2 public IPs. How does this work? Right, I'll seek to explain that using a diagram. So what I have here, if I go into my virtual network, is I have a demo network 02, right? In this demo network 02, I have 2 subnets, 3. So the Azure Firewall subnet, which contains my Azure Firewall, which is a network virtual appliance. It is managed, so I don't have OS level of access. I only access the Azure Firewall through the Azure control plane. Management subnet, which is just consisting of a single jump host, and a protected subnet, which consists of a VM. That is the focus of the demonstration. So if I draw this in graphical representation, I have a VNet here that's called demo network 02. I have 3 subnets. I have protected, I have management, and I have, so I think I should draw this differently. Okay, so I have management, I have protected, and I have Azure Firewall subnet. Okay, so based on this, I also mentioned that I have a jump host here. I have a protected VM here. So my whole goal, and of course I have an Azure Firewall here. My whole goal, right, is this. So all traffic from to and from this protected VM has to go through the Azure Firewall. Okay. So how this is done is there must be a user-defined route here. The user-defined route forces all traffic from the subnet to be routed to the VM. Oh, sorry, to the Azure Firewall, right? So how that works in Azure is I need to first show you, if I go into the protected subnet, can you see under route table, there is a FW route table, right? What is that? So FW route table, if I go into it, there is just one route, and the one route kind of covers all IP addresses. So regardless of whether I'm trying to access intranet resource or an internet resource, the next hop is always 10.15.255.4. So 10.15.255.4 is the private IP address of my Azure Firewall. So this rule would guarantee that all traffic going anywhere, and you can granularize this definition, right? But for me, all traffic will have to go to the Azure Firewall, right? And this rule is currently only applied to the protected subnet, which means to say only this subnet has this rule. My management subnet is not affected by this rule. Okay. So now, if I go into my virtual machines, you can see I have a jump host and I have a VM1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remote desktop into the jump host. So then I can show you remote into the protected VM1. Right. Oh, by the way, in the last session, remember I was showing you that my a point to site VPN failed, and that was because the certificate expired. I have since renewed that certificate, and if I just do a connect, you will be able to see that this will be connecting to the virtual network on Azure. Okay, can you see this is now connected? So just so happened that 2 days before the live stream last week, the certificate expired. I last checked 1 week before the presentation, before this part was failing. Okay, back to this. I almost feel like there's too much content to cover and too little time. So I'm just gonna go to 40.65.160.88. And I'm asked to log in. I always embarrass myself because I don't remember my passwords, but okay, managed to get in on the second try, which is not too bad. Right, so here I am in the jump host, and I need to access the protected VM, and the way that I access it is through its private IP of 10.15.1.4. 10.15.1.4, and you will be able to see that I can access that VM, right? Because it's intranet. Now, to demonstrate to you the Azure Firewall, there are two modes of connections that I want to be talking about. And from a whiteboard, so from a theory perspective, I would break traffic into two categories: inbound and outbound. Right. So traffic that is going outbound, you can then break this into two different set of rules that you can configure. You can configure network level rules or application level rules. So, and this I'm talking in context of the Azure Firewall now, right? So, in fact, the whole portion here is in context of Azure Firewall. Okay. So for network rules, right? In layman terms, it just means IP address, IP-based network. You know what? Let me just erase this. So IP-based network filtering. And for application rules, this is FQDM-based network filtering. And if you remember that what I was saying at the start of this session, I said that for network security group, you don't have this. If you want to use FQDM-based rules, you must use an Azure firewall. Sorry, you must use a next-gen firewall. It can be a firewall belonging to any one of our partners like Checkpoint, Barracuda, and so on, or it can be Azure Firewall, right? And for inbound traffic, this is just based on IP. So for this, what we really call it, we call it net rules, right? So what really happens is your Azure Firewall may have a few different public IPs. So let's say you have a public IP1 and you have a public IP2. And for any traffic, so for all traffic from the protected VM that comes to Azure Firewall, it will go out through maybe one of the public IP addresses. And maybe if you access the firewall's public IP2, then you would have a rule that routes the traffic back to this VM. Maybe at a certain point, you might have a different VM here that serves a different purpose, right? Maybe this is your finance app and this is your HR app. And what you would do is you would create a third IP address, and any traffic that tries to access this IP address on the firewall, your firewall can be configured to route traffic to that VM or that load balancer or application gateway, right? So this is how it works. Instead of traffic going directly to the VM or to the load balancer or application gateway, traffic instead, for inbound traffic, instead it goes to the Azure Firewall's public IP address, and Azure Firewall, based on which IP address is the traffic is coming in from, will route the traffic to the correct endpoint. And here, let me show you the configuration and demo. So if I go into my Azure Firewall, under rules, can you see there are 3 tabs here? Net rule collection, network, and application rule. So net rule is basically exactly what I talked about for inbound. Network and application rules are what I talked about for outbound, right? So just taking a look at the net rule collection, I have one rule. The one rule states, I allow web inbound, right? That's the name, but what does that mean? It means for any traffic coming in from any source, right? The destination address is an IP address that is reserved for the firewall. Remember, I was saying that there are two IP addresses in my environment, and I said that public IP2 is the one that I use to route traffic to the protected VM. This is that public IP2, and I can show you for public IP configuration. Can you see the rule here? It says .230, right? Can you see .230 is one of the 2 public IP addresses I have associated with Azure Firewall, right? So let me go back to the rules. And so let me complete the rest of the wizard. So you can see that I have configured 2 ports, port 80 and port 443. And the translated IP address is the private IP address of my protected VM. And that translates into ports 80 and 443. So you can have custom ports that translate into different backend ports. So that's the purpose of NAT, network address translation. So now let me try to access this endpoint. If I just go into this endpoint, can you see this? I can therefore access the protected VM's web page using the firewall's public IP address. And that is how you can filter traffic for inbound connections. Next. So if I take a look at network rule collection and application rule collection, by default, Azure Firewall will block all outbound traffic, right? It will block all. So it's a blacklist by default kind of approach. And if you want to allow any traffic, you will have to specify the endpoints that you want to whitelist. So for network rule collection, this is going to be a set of IP addresses and IP address ranges. So you can see, so basically what I have implemented here is I want the protected VM to be able to access any Office 365 endpoint, but nothing else, just Office 365 and all the corresponding services like CDNs and Azure AD logins that are important in my experience to access Office 365. So based on the documentation, which is on our public docs website, I have whitelisted this whole range of IP addresses, and each row corresponds to the different services outlined in our documentation. And if I go into application rule collection, you will see that I also have a whole bunch of FQDM-based routing rules. So if I kind of show you any one of these, it can go really long, right? It's not just a few. Some of them can go really, really long, right? So like this one is like the whole list on its own. And so all of these rules are added because these are the endpoints in our documentation to access M365 and Office 365. So here in my protected VM, oh, that's unfortunate. I think if I restart the VM, that will change. It's just I have kept it shut down for too long a time. And also I might be blocking its access to Windows activation servers. So that is an extra point to consider. So here I have a web browser. Can I access google.com? No. Can I access can.com? Sorry. No. But why is it that while on one page you have this generic error, while on the other page you get an error message that is that is coming from the firewall? Why? For HTTPS traffic, we simply show you this generic error message. And that's to do with we don't have full access into the encrypted channel for TLS, but we are able to see where the traffic is headed. For CNN.com, this is on HTTP endpoint, so that's on port 80, and it's not encrypted. So we are able to show you that from this private endpoint, which is the protected VM, trying to access CNN.com on port 80, there is a deny action on the firewall. Why? There is no whitelisting rule matched, so the default action is to deny. Now, if I go to office.com, right, can you now see that I'm able to access office.com? I'm logged in because previously I have logged into this account before, right? So, and if I access any one of the corresponding websites like OneDrive and Outlook, they all should work because I have unblocked all of Office 365's endpoints, right? So that's how Azure Firewall is intended to function. So this is a demonstration of Azure Firewall. So with that, I will conclude my chapter on networking and network traffic filtering. And this is basically what we discussed about. And in fact, it's been an hour. It's longer than I expected. But we can now switch gears to Azure DevOps. Okay. So at this point, I think depending on your role, if you're infrastructure, then the next portion might be quite foreign to you. And if you're a developer, thanks for not falling asleep, because the networking part is very different from what you as a developer experience day to day. So now let's get on with the topic proper on ASP.NET application code management as well as CI/CD pipelines. So the approach that I'm going to use is primarily a demonstration-based approach. And what I'll do is I will show you through a series of demonstrations, and I'll create an environment from scratch to illustrate the points that I want to show you, right? This might run a bit over. In fact, I'm not even sure if it might be a bit, but I hope you'll be available to watch this. Now, so let me just go back to my Azure DevOps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new project, right? So in terms of, so for developers, it's very common that we adopt code management services like Azure DevOps, Git, private Git, even a basic SVN is useful compared to, passing code, right? Like if I make changes to code and I pass by an email or a thumb drive, that is very chaotic. Nobody in 2020 should be passing code via thumb drive or email, right? Everybody who works on code should be using some kind of a repository to check in code so that code from multiple developers can be managed effectively, right? So here, I'm just going to create a new project, and later on, I will create a new ASP.NET application, and I'll check the code into this Azure DevOps repository. So if I draw on a diagram, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create an Azure, DevOps repo. What then I'm going to do is from Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new ASP.NET application, and I'm going to check in that code into Azure DevOps repo. And what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to configure a build pipeline. So the build pipeline will essentially help me compile the code that I write using ASP.NET. And this build pipeline, so the outcome or the goal of the build pipeline is that it will come up with what I'll call an artifact. And this artifact can then be used for release. And for release pipeline, I'm going to show you quite a few environments, right? Because in a standard organization, you would have a series of business processes to handle release, right? in most enterprise scenarios, you would have first and foremost a dev environment, and then you would, if tests on the dev environments are okay, you would then continue the deployment into UAT, and this is where business users will come in to check on your progress, and so they will basically check, right, whether the functionalities that you have coded are in line with their business requirements in the first place. And if they give the approval, then finally that code is then deployed into production. Okay, so this is kind of the pipeline that I'm going to build tonight, and I hope I can do it within the next hour. It's possible if you know what you're doing, I think. So, and in my environment, this environment is a VM that sits in my VMware environment. So let me just see if I can. Oh, I forgot to turn on my VMware server. Sorry, just one moment. One moment. Okay. Sorry. I had a whole day of meetings, and I totally this totally slipped my mind. So what I'm doing now is basically just waking my physical box using from my PC, and I'll give that like a few minutes, and my VMware server should then start running. Okay, back to the whiteboard. Okay, so this is sitting on-prem, right? And then I'm going to deploy into my UAT environment, which is there are really two UAT environments. One is a VM that is sitting on Azure. The other is a web app that is also sitting on Azure. And this is something that I'm using deployment slot. And I explain what deployment slot roughly when I reach that. So code should be deployed to both, right? And once this is done, I would then have in production, I have a 2 VM system. Why? Taking into account high availability I talked about in the last session. So you shouldn't have a single box environment for any production environments, because that would be a single point of failure, right? So I would have 2 Azure VMs based on Azure. Of course, there will be a load balancer that's load balancing traffic to these 2 VMs. I would also have a web app on Azure. And this deployment slot that I was talking about is really a deployment slot under this app service. And I'll show you what that is in a bit. So I would consider building out this whole scenario in the next 1.5 hours. If you watch along, this is the overall objective that I'm trying to reach in this session. So I first start by creating an, let me just check. Because one of the things I was discussing with Chun Lin was, we should do some live deployments on this in this session, so we can have some action. Things can break, and we can take out. It's not a real customer session, right? So if things break, it's not so bad, right? Okay, so this is taking its time. I think it's starting up. I think. Oh, sorry, my bad. It's not, because my smart plug was turned off. So I need to turn on the power and do that again. My bad. Sorry, I should have prepared for this. Right. So first, let me create a project. I'm gonna call it MD Web. MD stands for Massive Dynamic, which is my fictitious company, and web is just a website, right? I'm going to use private because I don't want the rest of the whole Microsoft organization to be able to see my code, because it's just a regular, it's just going to be a blank ASP.NET template. And I'm going to go ahead and create. That is being Okay, so it has to create first before I can connect to this repository. So once this is created, if I go into repo, can you see now I have a Git repository? Right, at this point, I'm the only available user who can contribute code unless I start adding people into the same project. Okay, so I'm going to fire up Visual Studio. And once Visual Studio is turned on, I'm going to clone a repository, and I'm going to select Azure DevOps. So I'll give it a moment because I'm signed into the same account as Azure DevOps, and in Azure, I should be able to pull up a list of Azure DevOps resources. Okay. So this is coming in, dev.azure.com. I'm going to open that up. Massive Dynamic, that is my organization. And also, if I just open MD Web, which I just created, I can then choose Connect. Okay, so now that I have connected, just check this. Oh, I see. That is bad. I have so the name was duplicated. So let me just close this and restart this. Okay, so let me just close the solution and restart this. Okay, I'm just gonna close that because there was an existing website that I was not aware of. I think that was created a long time ago, and his name was also MD Web. So source. There we go. That's the culprit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete it. Okay. So I'm going to recreate that or reconnect to that repository. And in the meantime, I'm going to check my, okay, there we go. It's online now. And that VM on, sorry. I'm going to exit maintenance mode. And I'm going to start my SQL and my, oh, so I have two VMs, okay. I forgot all about that. Okay, so I'm going to start this. I'm also going to start my SQL. Yeah, okay. As in my Microsoft SQL. There's another MySQL, which I'm not using. All right. And let me go back to Visual Studio, dev.azure.com, mdyn, mdweb, connect. Okay, so here I'm just going to click on clone. And because it is an empty repository, there will be absolutely nothing that will be put, right? Because I'm starting this from scratch. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new solution and check in the code. So I'm going to start using ASP.NET Web Application. And if I just call this MD Web, using ASP.NET 4.7.2, click on Create. And for this, I'm going to use the MVC framework. And to demonstrate on database connections, I'm going to change the authentication to individual user accounts. Because if I do this, then there will be associated database that will be created as part of this website. And so I can show you when we do this deployment into the different environments, obviously we will be needing to use different databases. And therefore, how can we automate the different SQL strings or the connection strings so that your UAT environment does not have a database connection to your production database. That would be quite catastrophic in the production scenario. All right, so okay, click on Create. In the meantime, right, for those of you who are watching, can you let me know whether you're developers or are you infra, just curious to check in? What are your thoughts around Azure DevOps? And in the meantime, hit that subscribe button and like the stream. I'm sorry, I don't do YouTube videos, and I always wanted to do that, right? Because I keep watching YouTubers say that, so it's a cool opportunity for me to do that. Right. Okay. So I have created a MD web solution. I just double click that, and I should be able to open that solution in Solution Explorer. And here we are. You can see at the bottom that I have basically a lot of files to check in now, right? So Git is the mode that I'm using, and all of these are just being flagged as new files to be added, right? There is some best practices on which files that you should add and which files you should not add. And I think the developers in the audience, you are more qualified than me to go through that process of doing ignore. But I'm just not going to go through that. I'm just going to check in everything. Some of you will cringe, and I apologize in advance for that. I'm more from an infra background, so this is useful. Okay, so that is strange. I should be seeing a run button, but I'm not. But that is okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this change icon. Oh, thank you, Alice. That's encouraging. Yeah, developer plus DevOps. Yeah, makes sense. So I'm going to write a message. I'm going to say initial commit, and I'm just going to commit all my code. In best practice, you should be ignoring a lot of these files. But since I'm the only developer in this repository, this is not going to be an issue for me. All right. So once I click commit, all that change is being committed into my local Git repository. I now need to push that commit into Azure DevOps. So just to prove it to you, under files, there's still nothing here. It's empty. So I need to push this into Azure DevOps. And so now Visual Studio will go through the process of uploading all 459 files. And okay. So when that is done, if I just refresh on the files, can you now see that I do have a list of I do have a list of files, right? Did not expect there to be a MD web and then MD web again, but okay, this will come in useful later on, because the step to change or to dynamically change the connection string in web.config, that step needs to know the relative file path, right? So, okay, so we can now see the code coming in, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a build pipeline so that our ASP.NET code will be built by Azure DevOps. So we're going to create a pipeline. And I'm just going to use the classic editor, but if you're, yes, Alice, you're correct. The v.vs folder should be excluded, but let's just proceed with this. I'm going to use the classic editor, but if you are using the new version of DevOps, you can absolutely use any of the new methods that is YAML-based, YAML. But if you use the classic editor, there is, in my personal opinion, a more friendly step-by-step, next done kind of experience to set this up, right? But if you're a seasoned developer and you're familiar with YAML, you can go ahead and use the modern approach, right? So I'm using MDWeb as the project repository MDWeb, which is my repo. I'm on the master branch. I don't have any other branches at this point, but in the production environment, you would have multiple branches, and the release pipelines will be based on the different branches, and that would make sense. So if I press continue, the build is for ASP.NET Web Application. So I'm just going to apply this. And so there are a few things that I need to configure. I'm okay with Visual Studio 2017 on Windows Server 2016. But if you are doing .NET Core 3.0 or 3.1 development, you should use Windows 2019 that uses Visual Studio 2019. Right? Otherwise, the framework may not be part of Visual Studio 2017, and the build process will fail. So you can see that by default, it added a bunch of tasks. So we use NuGet version 4.4.1. NuGet is a package manager. It will restore a lot of the packages that is needed in a lot of modern applications. A lot of modern applications write on modern packages that are kept up to date by third-party developers. This is so we are not the pioneers, right? NuGet is by no means the pioneer. This idea came from the world of Linux, and Linux is very common for you to restore packages and for you to install software using packages, and this is precisely that concept. And we will do a NuGet restore. What this means is that the package manager will restore all the packages that your project or ASP.NET application has defined that it needs for operations. For example, if you use newtonsoft.json, then it will restore the newtonsoft.json package, and you don't have to include that in the check-in, right? It will build the solution. And if you have test cases, it can also run to help you with your test case. For my environment, I'm just going to remove this as an extra step. I'm just not going to put in any test case. Oh, sorry, my bad. This should be automated test cases. I'm not going to have automated test cases. But if you look at my pipeline, I would absolutely have a UAT environment where manual tests can take place, right? So now, and finally, I will publish the symbols path and publish artifact. Remember, the outcome of a build operation is to have an artifact. So this artifact can then be used to create a release pipeline. So I'm going to leave this as is. Now, from the pipeline, do I have anything more to add? Yes. I need to go to triggers, and I need to enable CI, continuous integration, right? What this means is so if I check this box, if I check in code, this will automatically trigger a build operation. And I'll show you through a demo. There are several different options and variables that you can use. I will not go into those today. Those can get quite daunting, especially for non-developers in the audience. I know I myself was overwhelmed with that information when I first picked up Azure DevOps. So I'm also the name here you can edit, right? So mdwebasp.net CI, right? So you can change this name. I'm just going to save this. So of course, the best practice is with every change to the pipeline, you should give a comment in the spirit of the title of this session, from planning to production. So if this is a production environment, you should always follow the policies defined in your organization on the right content to comment. Okay. So now if I go into the pipelines, I can see that there is a pipeline, and there's no runs yet. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into this Solution Explorer, and I'm just going to change some code. So if I go into Views, I go into Shared, and I go into Layout. I'm just going to change this template from application name just to Massive Dynamic. So the moment I saved this file, you can see that there is one pending change. Right? If I just click that change, it has identified layout.cshtml as the thing that changed. And so I'm just going to give in a command to say changed title to Massive Dynamic. And I'm going to press commit all and push. So what's the difference between push and sync? Sync, there are two actions that are associated with sync. When you do a sync, that's both a pull and a push. Why do you want to do a pull, right? In the normal development environment, you will not be the only developer who will work on this code base. There will be other developers who work on this code base, and for those other developers, and when they check in code, you will not automatically have a copy of their code. You need to use the pull operation to pull down the code changes that they made, and if there is any conflicts with the code that you are developing, you have to disambiguate and basically handle all the conflicts before you can then have the option to push your code out, right? So I have done that push, and if I just do a refresh, you can see that the build pipeline is already running for the past 16 seconds now. And if I just go into the stages, you will be able to see a console output. And on the left, you have basically a list of tasks. And this list of tasks is very similar to the list of tasks that we were configuring just a moment ago. It breaks some of these down into further subtasks, but the flow is exactly what we have configured. So obviously this will take time. This is basically Azure DevOps using compute resources to compile the code, right? So if you are working on .NET, it will have Visual Studio on the backend to compile your code. If you're working on a Swift application for Mac OS, then we will have Xcode on the backend that can compile your code. And if you're working on Java, then we'll absolutely have the Java SDK and the Java compiler that will compile your code, right? So we're not limited to just .NET. You can use Azure DevOps for practically any language. And for languages that require compilation, we should have the necessary engines. Unless you're on a really obscure development platform, we should have the necessary backend engine to help compile your code. So this is the end of the agent operation. At this point, you can see that there has been one artifact that has been produced. And this basically is that output that we expect. And in the release pipeline, it will be able to pick up this drop and push it into the various environments that we will configure. So at this point, we are done with here. We are done with the repo. We are done with the pipeline, and we now have an artifact. Also, as a bonus, if I show you my email, you can see that I do get an email to say that based on this pipeline, this has been succeeded. And in total, this took 83 seconds. Right, so this is part of Azure DevOps notifications. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to configure the release pipeline. Right, we are first going to configure our dev environment. In fact, to update the diagram, is no longer one VM, it's two VMs. We have inside our ESXi environment. So for that, let me first connect to the two VMs. Okay. I can't actually remember all my IP addresses, so I actually have a file to keep that in check. I'm just going to pull that to the side. And okay, so my first VM. Oh, actually, I forgot I have it right here. So this has been previously configured. I'm just going to log in first to my sorry, not MySQL, but MS SQL. Okay, just to verify that the VM is online and I have the proper access to the database. So I have done some preparation right before this session, and that is creating all the necessary infrastructure to deploy the code to. That process is can take a few hours. So if I'm able to finish the whole process in like an hour and a half, that is not representative of the total time it takes to come up with this demo. The infrastructure has is a force to be reckoned with. So as I think can't remember the user. I'll just log in and check. Okay, so I have first and foremost created an MD web database. And if you look at the tables, you'll realize that this database is empty because we adopted the code-first approach by using MVC.NET. What happens is the objects that we code into our application will be automatically translated into transactional database tables, and those will be automatically populated in the database by the framework instead of us having to manually populate the database. So it's always convenient for a demo. Okay, so let me just check what is the user. So I have SAMD web, right? So if I configure a connection string, I should ideally use this user because I have scoped this user to, well, it is a sysadmin, but in the production environment, this user's permissions will be scoped to MD web only, and I must have, so don't follow this. This is not best practice, okay? Right. All right, so my Microsoft SQL Server is online. I'm gonna disconnect. I'm gonna connect to my two VMs. And for this, I wanna exit full screen so that I can have Windows. Right. So I have IaaS 1 and IaaS 2. What I'm going to be doing in this exercise is I will be installing agents on both of these VMs so that they can receive the deployments from Azure DevOps, right? So let me show you how it works from Azure DevOps. So in order for Azure DevOps to deploy code onto any virtual machines, the virtual machines must be installed with the right agents. So I need to go into deployment groups. Okay, so right now it's empty. So I'm just going to add a deployment group. I'm now going to call this the MD web. Sorry, I'm just going to call it UAT, right? So this is the UAT environment. I'm going to click, sorry, this is not UAT, this is dev, my bad. This is dev. I'm going to create. And once I create, you can see under targets, I have no targets. But the moment that I install VM agents, the VM's names will show up in this list. And if I go into details, you will see that I have a PowerShell script here. And if I run this PowerShell script on so it depends on whether you're on Windows or Linux. Linux, we have a different script. For Windows, we have a PowerShell script. And in order, so just to make things streamlined, I'm going to create a personal access token for authentication. But if this is a production environment, you should be going into the personal access tokens pane and configure a personal access token for your whole. You should keep a log of all the PATs that you create. And as a value-added service, any PATs that you create within the organization, there will also be an email triggered, and it shows you the originating IP that created this personal access token. Okay, so once that token is checked, I'm just going to copy this script to clipboard, and I'm going to run that on both of these VMs. Must have. Okay, so I'm just going to run, and this will take some time to complete, and I will do the same. This VM. I'm not sure what that is. Okay. I haven't encountered that in my test. Might have something to do with running PowerShell as administrator. I'm not sure. Okay, this is not what do you call that? Like you can't just run this and walk away and get coffee, right? Because there are some questions that they will ask. For example, do you want to enter deployment group tags? So in the real life production environment, you should absolutely use group tags. Group tags is a bit like resource tagging on Azure. You should absolutely tag your deployments to label them into that can help you with choosing the right deployment targets in future. So since this is a demo environment, I'm just gonna leave that as no. And it also asks for the user account for the service. So for this non-domain joint PC, I'm just gonna leave it as system. But if you have service principals, you can configure service principals to as an identity to run the pipeline agent. Okay, so this VM, and I'll do the same for the second VM. And so when that is done, if I come back to Azure DevOps and I go into targets, you will see that I have 2 machines with the right names that are configured. So right now, what I have done is, let me go back to the architecture. So what I've done is I have managed to onboard 2 VMs onto my deployment group. So what I have not done, however, is to actually create the release pipeline. So now that I have at least the dev environment configured as a valid deployment group, I will then create the release pipeline. Right. So here, let me go into releases, and you'll see that this is going to be empty. I'm going to create a new pipeline. So the first step is it will ask you, right, what is the template you want to use? you can start with an empty drop, right? And that is when you use custom frameworks and you have custom built agents. But for me, deploying an IaaS website is well defined and well supported. So here I have an IaaS website deployment. I'm just going to click apply, and I'm just going to call this dev. I'm just going to call it dev, and there are 2 VMs, right? So once this is done, so I'm just also going to rename the pipeline. I'm going to call this MD Web Release. So under this pipeline, I first need to add an artifact. Because if you look at that diagram, you'll realize that in order for the release pipeline to work, you must configure an artifact. And so this has to be from the drop that I was showing you earlier. So we're going to click and add an artifact. Build project will be MD Web, and the source will be the CI build process that we have defined. Once that is configured, and if you just click add, the artifact will be configured. At this point, the release pipeline is still manual. So if I click on this lightning icon here, I can just check this radio box, right? And it becomes CD, continuous delivery. Continuous deployment. So what this means is with every successful build, you can automatically release. So the release pipeline will function. But so this is not the only way for you to automate release. You can also automate release based on time, on a scheduled time. So you can have like on a specific day every week at a certain time. You can add multiple times for that schedule to run. So for this demo, I'm just not going to leave it as enabled. I'm just going to use the build process as a trigger. Okay. So here I have a single artifact. I have a single environment, but I need to modify this environment. The first thing I need to do is, so default website, right? That is corresponding to the IaaS web server. And within my Azure, my VM, my VMware VM, you can see that under sites, I have a default website. If you're trying to deploy to a different website, right, you should change this name, right? It should be something else. So I'll just leave default website as is. Minimize this. Okay, so the thing that I need to configure is the deployment group. Because when we created this release pipeline, we have not defined the deployment group or the group of VMs that we're trying to deploy to. So in this case, I'll choose dev. And I'll just leave everything else as default. However, at this point, I just wanted to show you in code, right? And I go into Solution Explorer and I go into web.config. Can you see that? Hey, this is. Hey, did I not create the one with identity? Oh, crap. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong web.config. Right. Scared me for a moment. Okay, so can you see in web.config, I have a default connection. You can see that this is the connection string. And obviously this will not work because this uses the local DB when in reality, we want to use, this shared Microsoft SQL Server. Right. So in order to do that, we need to create what we call a variable. And this variable we'll need to apply an XML transformation. Actually, that's a variable replacement. And we're just going to try to replace default connection. So here we'll use default connection, and the value should be the connection string. So in this case, I'm just going to try to copy this and modify based on that. So I will not modify the code. I will leave the code as is. I will let the pipeline replace the connection for me. Right. So data source, to be very honest, I have not prepared this. So let me just take a little bit of help. So I have SQL databases. I need to scope that to the right subscript. subscription, which is my colleague's subscription. So this is where networking comes really useful for me, right? I have a friend. Her name is Mai. She's based in HR. And she does not use her Azure subscription. So I kind of friendly took over her $150 a month credits so I can have credits for demonstrations like this. So to me, this is where networking comes in, as in social networking comes in very helpful. Right, so I'm just going to take this as a reference and change the structure. Copy. Okay. So instead of this, I have the IP address of my SQL server, which is 192. So in my dev environment is going to be completely running on premises. Therefore, the database will also be based on my on-prem private IP address. So that would be 1.20. Okay, 1433 MD web without the prod. And I think that's SA_MD web. For password, I have the most secure password at Microsoft.com. Yep. I think this should suffice. I think. Okay. Disclaimer: I have not tried this, so this might fail. But the concept should be we will put the connection string here. We will press the log so that it now looks like a secret. And the scope, right, should not be released. Because if you put the scope to release, it will apply to all the stages, including the stages that we will build later for UAT as well as for production. So instead of release, I'm going to choose dev. And I need to go back to the task. I need to insert one new task, and that is file transform. Okay, so I need to add this, pull this to the top, and we need to transform an XML-based file. And so this is where I need a new tab because I need to get the relative file path of web.config. So if I go into MD-web, I go into repositories, I go into MD-web, web.config. So this is the file. So the relative file path is /mdweb/mdweb/web.config. So /md, come on. So, and all I really need to do is just save this. I'm just going to inspect the rest of the task. The two tasks that were created as part of IaaS deployment, but they look correct to me. All right. So I can manually create release, but the more fun thing to do is I initiate a change in my code, and we can watch the whole thing. So basically, it's going to trigger an automatic build process, and it's then going to trigger an automatic release process after the build is done. Right. So if I go back to Visual Studio, I'm just going to make one change, and that change, I'm just going to change something on the home page. So there's this huge H1 header 1 text that says ASP.NET. I'm going to replace this with Razor syntax because the more fun thing to do is to display the underlying VM name that is hosting this website. So I'm just going to do environment.machine name. And so this syntax will basically get me the machine, the underlying host name, and display it in this ASP.NET web page as a string. Okay, so once I made that change, I need to commit. So in the production environment, the .so file should have been excluded. Therefore, there should really only be just one change, which is index.cshtml. So display host name on homepage. And I'm just going to commit all and push because I know there's no other developers on this project. Therefore, there should be no other change to the code. So you can see already there is a build that has been scheduled. And we'll let that run it's time. So just in the meantime, right? If I sorry, that is my Azure environment. But if I go into my IaaS VMs, if you go to localhost now, you should just see the IaaS default page, right? So if this deployment is successful, you should see this page being replaced with an ASP.NET application with functional sign up and login functions. And the user identities should be persisted onto my on-premises Microsoft SQL Server. Okay, what's going on? It was just, the Ajax was just not updating, but it's still running. So the build process, we'll let the build process run. So far, does anyone have any comments or questions? You can post that onto the chat window. Oh, so so the build seems to be already done, right? So the Ajax was just not loading properly. And if I go into the release pipeline, it says tool in progress. So you can see based on, so the file transform is happening now. I'm not sure if I'm just lagging because this process shouldn't take so long. Already gotten the email that says my build has succeeded. It took like 1 minute and 15 seconds. Honestly, the file transform shouldn't take so long. Okay, so again, my Ajax was lagging, right? So everything is done, file transform, there was no errors. So now let's inspect from our two on-premises VMs. And so if I just refresh localhost, and you see this is our host name, this is our host name. So our web page has been deployed onto the dev environment. Now, just to check that the database is also working, I'm going to connect to my SQL Server. And I'm just going to, oh, sorry. You wouldn't see anything here as of yet because we have yet to access a function that will populate the database. So, however, what I do want to check is, did the file transform take place properly or not? So I'm just going to go to cinetpub www.root, and I'm going to verify this web.config. Okay, can you see that now this code has been replaced with the variable that we put into the Azure DevOps pipeline? Our source code, and this is to validate. If I go back to repositories, mdweb, web.config, in our source code, our connection string did not change, right? We didn't change the connection string from the code. We changed it during release pipeline, right? And this is the connection. So at this point, I'm not too sure whether the connection string works. So let's just try it out. So if I try to go to register on my IaaS1, and the first time oh, this should be slower, but it seems to be. So let's say if I use Stephen at dev, okay, dev. So it's Stephen at mdyn.org. Okay, that should be easier. Okay. Password. So I'm going to click register. Okay, so obviously there is an issue with the connection to on-prem. All right, says a connection was successfully established, but an error with the login process. The certificate chain was issued by, I am honestly not going to troubleshoot this because we are already kind of behind time. So I'm going to try one other thing. And if that does not work, then I'm just going to leave it, right? So I'm going to edit this off screen because I'm just going to use my SA account, and I'm going to use this server admin password in case it's a user provisioning issue. I'm not a SQL expert, so I might have gotten this part wrong. I'm going to try that again. Right, so there must be something, the connection between the web server and the SQL server on the certificate chain, there's something wrong. So I'm just gonna leave it, right? But you can see from a DevOps and dev perspective, you can see that the code has been pushed, and the release pipeline has successfully replaced the connection string. So if you have set up a web server and the SQL database connection properly, then the registration will work. I wouldn't worry on showing you this because the next thing that I'm going to show, which is the UAT environment, I have this working. I have tested that. So next, we're going to configure a UAT environment, and we're going to have two environments in terms of both VM and web app. And there's going to be a database that is also hosted on Azure as a PaaS service that will power the web app. So at this point, we have a pipeline, but we have only finished the dev portion. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to build the UAT portion and finally the production portion. All right, so let's go back to the DevOps. Now, I'm just going to follow this release, and I'm going to edit this pipeline. So what I'm going to add is I'm going to add a stage. And that stage is going to be another IaaS website deployment. It's very similar to the first one. And this, I'm going to call it UAT. And this UAT will be VM. Okay. So this is the part, right, where I just want to introduce to you the concept of approvals. And depending on your organization, there should be approval gates put in place, right? So if you deploy into dev, then before that code is deployed into UAT, someone on the dev team should give the final go ahead, and someone on the UAT team should then also accept the incoming change. And that really depends on the business process that your organization follows when you have a change request coming in, right? So here, right, you can see that there is a post-deployment approval, and you can key in approvers, and this is pulling information from your organization's Azure AD. And that same Azure AD can synchronize users from your on-premises Active Directory. And that can be like a whole 4-hour session for another time, because Azure AD Connect from on-premises domain controllers can be a really long topic to talk about. So I will not put a post-deployment gate, but however, I will put a pre-deployment approval into UAT. So in UAT, I'm just going to put my own name, but this, in the enterprise scenario, this could be a team lead in your dev team, or a UAT or a release management team. Depends on who should be the point of authority, but this person should be technical enough to be able to read the code or changes that are coming in, right? So the default timeout is 30 days. You can also check a box that says that the person who deployed the change should not be the same person as the approver. You can also have many different approvers. So when you key in many different approvers, any one of them approving will push the pipeline ahead. So you don't actually need all the approvers that you have configured to allow this to go through. You just need one. Okay, so I'm just going to configure my own name there. Once I do that, you will see a tick on the person icon. It means that there is a configuration for pre-deployment approval. By the way, this also exists in here, right? So it's up to you. Based on your business process requirements, you can configure those settings either pre-deployment or post-deployment or a combination of both. So what I am going to do is I'm going to configure the settings once again for IaaS deployment. Oh, so this reminds me, I have not added the UAT VM into the deployment group. So I should do that. But before I do that, I need to add another connection string. Again, default connection. And the SQL string should be, so instead of prod, I should be on the UAT. And once again, my very secure password of @microsoft.com or .c0m. Right, so this looks correct. So I'm just going to paste it in here and scope this variable to UAT-VM. Okay. Okay, so at this point, let me go back to the tasks. So the deployment group has not been configured, so I need to go into, oh, I see. So let me just open here, go into a different tab so that I can configure more VMs into the deployment group. So what I have here is a virtual machine, right? A virtual machine. It says MD-Web UAT VM1, right? Right now, if I access that public endpoint, I will hit the default IaaS web page because nothing has been deployed on it yet. So I'm just going to key in, right. So one thing I need to do is RDP here, but I don't have direct RDP access because by best practice, there should be a jump host and then I'll RDP inside here, which I believe I've already done, right? 40.65, oh no, sorry, that's my Azure Firewall endpoint. I should be closing this. And this 13.76.82.115 should be the correct jump host. 13.76.82.115, okay? So within this VM, I have already logged into it. So what I need to do is go back to my deployment groups and I need to create a new deployment group. So I'm going to create new, and instead of dev, I'm going to call this UAT. And once again, I will just repeat the same process and run that in the context of this 10.20.4.4, which is my web server in UAT environment. And in the interim, right, I might also as well add my two other VMs in prod VM1 and prod VM2. In order to access those VMs, I need to first remote desktop into the jump host, and then I can RDP via its private IP address endpoints. So once I'm in the jump host, I need to create two RDP sessions for the two VMs. So the first one will be 10.20.4.4. And the other is 10.20.4.5. Okay. So I need to repeat the process for the deployment group, but I should not be using the same PowerShell script because I need those for production. So it shouldn't be in the same deployment group. Before I close this, however, I believe there is configuration I have to complete with. I'm just going to go with the default settings, and this UAT target should be online. Okay, if I just do a refresh, okay, this is online now. Okay, so I need to go back. So now we have two deployment groups, right? Dev and UAT. Now I'm going to add one more for production. create. Again, it's going to show me this the script. I'm just going to copy the script to clipboard, and I'm going to run it in the context of my 2 VMs here, right? So for the first, so this is the second VM for production. And while this is running, I'm also going to configure that for the VM1. Everything I'm doing here, once again, I'm just installing an agent so that when I do release deployment, these agents will be able to pick up the new deployments. So for the networking folks on the call, this only requires outbound connection. So the agent will periodically sync with Azure DevOps endpoint and pull down any code changes. Right? It's not a push operation from Azure DevOps. So you don't have to actually open any inbound ports for this to work. This is kind of like your Azure AD Connect agent or ASR backup and disaster recovery agents. They all work the same way in terms of the traffic flow. Okay, let me check here. Right, so again, default configuration, and this should complete. And same with here. Okay, so this is running a bit slow. And this is done. Okay, so now with all these configured, I'm happy because now I can go back into deployment groups. If I just go into production and just so both of them are healthy now. So you can see that I have a dev environment. I have a UAT. So the right term is deployment group. So I have dev, UAT, and production deployment groups that are online right now, right? You see here 2 passing because we have already done the release into this environment. For the other 2 deployment groups, there has been no deployment yet. So if I go into release, I'm just going to complete the design phase of this. So now we only have a dev. I was configuring the release for UAT, right? And I wanted to choose the deployment group. So if I refresh this, I should be able to see UAT and production coming in. And because this is UAT, I'm just going to choose UAT. Right, everything. Okay, so the only difference is the only one action I need to do is to create the file transform. Add that in, paste that on the top. And once again, this is XML file. And the target file is just mdweb/web.config. All right. So everything else is default, and this should be good to go. So instead of testing this, I know we are already at 8 p.m. I hope to finish this at 8:30 p.m. So instead of testing this, I'm just going to design the rest of the pipeline, right? So if I go back to all pipelines and I just go into, okay, so if I go into edit, now you can see that I have dev, and after dev is done, an email will be sent to me, and I need to approve it before the deployment is done on UAT. All right. So there is one more thing that I'm going to configure. So remember in this, so this is a way to do CI/CD for infrastructure as a service, right? VMs. So what if I have a web app? So I have here under app services, I have a web app called MDYN. And right now, if I go into mdyn.azurewebsites.net, so this is just the Hello World equivalent, right? Once you create a web app on Azure, this is basically what you expect to see. Now, so this is going to be my production environment or co-production environment. So on top of the 2 VMs that I'm going to deploy, I'm also going to deploy this to the web app. But for UAT, I did mention that I'm going to create a web app. I'm going to create it as a deployment slot to the production web app. So how that works is, if I go into the deployment slots, you can see that I have created an MDY and UAT, and that is a separate deployment slot. And I've designed this specifically to be UAT, right? This is not going to load balance my traffic from my main site. So this is not a case of A/B testing. This is more of a specialized URL endpoint just for UAT, or a different version of the application. So in UAT environment, I'm going to deploy it to this endpoint, which once again, if I try to access it, you would just see an arbitrary hello world page. But how this works, right? For those of you who are used to on-prem IaaS, when you create a web app, right, you are asked to choose an app service plan. This app service plan is akin to your IaaS server. Once you have the app service plan created, you can create a number of websites to be hosted under the same app service plan, right? So this is akin to going into your IaaS server, and under sites, you create multiple different sites, but they are essentially running on the same IaaS server and therefore the same compute resource. All the websites running within the same app service plan will share the same compute resources on the back end. All right. So here, I'm trying to configure a continuous deployment for this web app. So how can I do that? So here, I need to have a branching operation. So I can click on add. Sorry, that is the wrong add. It's a bit counterintuitive sometimes. So here I need to click on add, new stage. Seems like I don't think I can branch from here, can I? Really should have done this beforehand, but I'm just going to click on, there we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to use Azure App Service deployment, right? Because we are deploying to an app service. Okay. So I'm going to click apply. Instead of calling this stage 4, I'm just going to call it UAT dash web app, right? That is on Azure. Okay, one job, one task. I'm going to click into that. First, I'm going to change the variable. So the default connection will still work. I guess once it's locked, you can't recover the text anymore. Okay. So I'm just going to add again default connection. I'm going to use the same UAT database, which is a hosted database. I'm just going to paste in the same connection string. I'm again going to lock this, but I'm going to scope this to UAT web app. Right. Coming back to tasks for UAT web app. So we first need to choose an Azure subscription. My web app is placed under my colleague's Azure subscription. And by default, Azure DevOps does not have direct access to deploy resources onto your Azure subscription. We talked about role-based access control briefly. And so we first need to add a service principal to the Azure subscription in order for DevOps to be authorized to deploy code into your Azure DevOps, into your Azure web app, right? So the shortcut way to do it is just to click authorize. But in a production environment, you should never rely on this button, because very, very quickly, you will create too many service principals and you will have a really hard time to track which service principals are used for what. And if you start doing that, you will end up like me, where if I go into my Azure subscriptions, let's just go into this subscription and go into access control, role assignments. You will see that I have all these contributors into my subscription, where I don't actually know, I can't remember at this point anymore when these service principals were created at a glance. And I would be afraid to remove any of them in case they are useful for some production environment. So I wouldn't advise you to just click authorize. I would suggest that you manually create this within Azure AD. Remember the one-time password and log in and configure login from here. But as a shortcut, I'm just going to click authorize so that I can deploy code from Azure DevOps. So this authorization has to be done before the list of available app services can be pulled up. So in app service name, so it's already picking up this app service. So at this point, it's not going to show me my deployment slot, and that is perfectly fine because that configuration exists somewhere. Additional deployment options, nope. Post deployment, nope. One moment. Pretty sure it's here because I've seen it before. Oh, here. Can you see here there's a checkbox that says deploy to slot or app service environment? So if you just check that checkbox, and so I'm going to choose the correct resource group. And you can already see that I have 2 deployment slots configured, production and UAT, right? So I'm just going to choose UAT. That is going to be my deployment slot. And so this will override the code to be deployed to the UAT environment and not the main deployment slot. Okay. So as part of this, we also want to apply the XML variable substitution. In this case, we don't have to use the file transform task because the XML variable substitution as a subtask is sufficient to replace the default connection variable that is scoped to the UAT web app, right? So under tasks, this is configured. I'm just going to press save. So I'm just going to do a deployment at this point to validate. And instead of making a change and trigger the build process, because we already know that works, I'm not going to waste the time to wait for it to compile. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to the main release window, and I'm just going to create a release. And you can see that the scope of the release is going to be applied to dev, UAT VM, and UAT web app. And I'm just going to click on create. So it says release 2 has been queued. And there's a reason why it says it is queued, right? If you use the free version of Azure DevOps, okay, you only have one compute resource. That compute resource will be responsible to handle any build operations as well as release operations that you are running in your environment. If you need more than one compute resource, there are 2 methods that you can obtain more compute power. Number 1, you upgrade to a paid version of Azure DevOps, and you pay for the compute instances that can help you release your code and build your code. And the second option is you create virtual machines either on Azure or in your on-prem or other clouds, and you use those VMs as compute resources, which means to say you have to have the right agents and you have to have the right compilers and all of those good things in your environment, which is a lot more work. As you can see, so on the UAT web app, right, I did not configure the approval. However, in the UAT VM, there is already an email being sent to me. It says that, hey, this deployment is waiting for your approval, right? And it is my responsibility to check what are the changes that have been made at code level, and should I be approving or rejecting this change, right? So if I reject, I can press cancel. But if I am in agreement with the change, I just click approve. I can't give a command, right? And I can just approve. So once the approval is done, then then will the release take place. Okay, so this is going into the UAT VM, and this, you can see that this has already succeeded. So now let's scope back to the app service, and let's just first check the main app service, and you should not see code deployed here. Okay, I'm just going to close all these windows. See, if I come here, you can see that this is still the default page. There's nothing changed here. Now, if I go into the deployment slot and view the UAT environment by opening up a new tab and press enter, and I just refresh that, I think there's a cache thing going on. The first load is going to take some time because number one, it needs to download all the information and cache it, and number two, I believe it will be creating the database on the back end. I'm not familiar enough with this template to tell whether the database is being populated at the when you register an account or when you first load the web page. But yeah, so this is loaded. So this gives you an idea of the naming convention that web apps use in the underlying virtual machines. We are just going to click register and give this a try. Because in this environment that I've configured, the database connection should work. I think on first load, it is just really slow. It's been my consistent experience that the first load is always slow, but after that, it's fine. Once again, Stephen at mdin.org. So if the connection string works, then the registration process should succeed. Okay, so and this succeeded, and you can see that I'm now logged in, and we can check the endpoint database. First, we scope. Okay, so we scope to the database. If I go into UAT, and so I just need this, right? So let me just connect database engine. So I've pre-populated all this information. I've also whitelisted my, so if I get set server firewall, I have specifically allowed my IP address. So for the rest of you who have SQL Server Management Studio, you should not be able to connect to my endpoint. If I go into databases, you can see I have a prod and UAT database. And if I just expand tables in UAT, you should be able to see a list of tables that have been created as part of the MVC framework. So I have here DBO ASP.NET users, and I just select top 1,000 rows. And you can see that there is the user account that exists here, right? So this is definitive proof that the SQL Server connection is working and the web.config has been updated. One other way to check the web.config if you're using app service is if you come into the web service and go into the deployment slot, go into the right app service, and you just hit on this app service editor, and you just press go. This will basically show you a list of files that have been published to this endpoint or to this app service. And you can then open any one of these up. And this is kind of like a text editor. So you can see here, this is the correct connection string that has been populated. This is md web-uat, right? But because continuous deployment is enabled, I get a warning because whatever change I make here on the next release, everything will be overwritten, right? Okay, so at this point, you can see that we have this release pipeline that is towards UAT VM and UAT web app. So just for familiarity's sake, I'm just going to add one more stage. And for the rest of you, it's getting kind of late. If you want to drop off, you can. I think what I'm going to say next, there will be no new information. I'm just going to go through the process of creating this again and to close the loop on our overall architecture to complete the production environment. And once we do that, we would have created the whole process end to end. So I'm going to take it as a personal challenge to complete it in the next 15 minutes. So There I will be. Sure, I need to go back to releases. So now you can see that now there are all these tags in place for release 2. I'm going to go for edit. Oh, I didn't show you the UAT VM now, have I? So if I just go into the virtual machines, UAT VM, once again, just navigating to that IP address. And if I do a refresh, just remove the cache. And so in this environment, instead of doing registration, I'm just going to directly log in, right? Because both sources are connected to the same database. So since I've already registered this, I should be able to immediately log in. Okay. Can you now see that I've logged in, right? Without having to register this because they are sharing the same database. And this is the host name of that VM. So any change that I make to the pipeline, both of these environments will get it. All right. So now let me switch back to so that I want to populate this. And I also want to populate these VMs. So this is the public IP, not of the VM, but of the load balancer. You can tell because both VMs share the same public IP. So at this point, this is pointing to one of the VMs. I can't tell which, but let me just configure the deployment. So I'm going to add a stage. Sorry, not from there. I need to add this stage here. I'm going to call it, it's going to be IaaS deployment. So this is going to be prod VMs. Done. I'm also going to add a stage here. I'm going to call this prod web app. Sorry, apps service deployment prod web app. All right, done. So you should absolutely configure permissioning here, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to skip that. For this, once again, we need to configure the deployment group. So the deployment group in this case is production. And we need to just add one task, which is file transform add. And the file format is going to be XML. The target files is mdweb/mdweb/web.config. Okay. So, and under here, we need to add 2 more variables of default connection. And we should use the database of the production environment instead of the UAT environment. So if I view the connection strings, I just come to my notepad and once again, replace my password. Okay, here. Paste this in, lock this, scope this to prod VMs. Again, add this default connection, same string, and prod web app. Lock this, so this is done. And coming back to tasks, I think this is done now. So what I need to configure then is the prod web app. And for prod web app, once again, I need to select the right subscription. Okay, rise again. Oh, I think this has been pre-authorized actually, so I can just choose the pre-authorized setting. Since I've already done the authorization earlier on, right? And for app service, I'm just going to choose mdin. And in this case, I'm not going to choose deployment slot because then it will deploy the code to the production environment. All right. I do, however, need to configure file transforms. And for this, I just need to check XML variable substitution instead of adding the file transform task. Oh, I just realized I have a 9 p.m. meeting, so I need to wrap this up anyway. Okay. Okay, you can see, and I hope I haven't missed anything. If I go into all pipelines, You can now see that. Sorry, let me go back to release. Edit. And now see that I have configured this whole pipeline. And this is looking exactly like what we have set out to do, right? So now we have this Azure VM done, web app deployment slot done, 2 VMs done, web app done. And so we have configured the release pipeline for UAT. We've also configured the release pipeline for production, right? So this is really the end-to-end how you can configure this. And I'm just going to give this a run to let it run from end to end, just to show you how the experience is like. Release 3 has been configured. Sorry, guys, I really hate to be that person. Like, when I was young, I had tuition teachers, and they're so so serious at their work. They often track the sessions and give me more time without asking my parents to pay for more tuition time. But as a kid, I absolutely hated those, and I thought I hate to be that guy who extends your community meetup session. But we are almost done, right? So again, approval is waiting. Approve. Okay. So this is in progress. This is in progress. This is not deployed yet. So as an example, if I just refresh this is going to look the same, and this is also going to look the same. So these are my 2 production environments. We'll just let this run. And I hope nothing goes wrong. So far, does anyone have any questions or feedback, or has everyone kind of fallen asleep already? The reason why I'm building so many stages is because the whole point of this session is to give you a taste of production. It's fun, right? If you just have one VM, a single VM, and you just deploy and it succeeds, it's a good proof of concept. But in a production environment, you will have at least these stages to work with, and perhaps many different branches of code that you will work with. So knowing the complexity, or having a taste of that complexity, is important, in my opinion, to give you a taste of what production is like. And as you can see, there are some additional tasks that you would go through from a best practices perspective that you should be aware of. Where if this is your own UAT or dev environment, that you can choose not to care. Thanks, Alice, for the encouragement. Okay, so you can see that the prod VMs are already done, and therefore I'm just going to hard refresh this page and wait for the web app to complete. Oh, the web app is also now done, so I'm going to hard refresh that page as well. Okay, can you see? Okay, so the VM is still taking some time, but from a web app, right, that has been deployed, and you can see that this and this have the same host name. Why? Because like I was telling you, if you have 2 web apps sharing the same app service plan, right, they are really on the same physical host, because they are like 2 different websites handled by the same IaaS server, right? But the difference is, in this case, if I try to log into that account, I will not succeed, because this is my production. This is running on my production database. This is not my UAT database. Okay, so for this, I'll click register, but right. So if I try to log in using the same username and password, this should be telling me that this will fail. And I think the first time is just slow, but see, it says invalid login attempt, whereas the same set of username and password can be used to access the UAT environment. And that is because this is running on production. So I'm just going to use a different email. And once the registration is done, I will then log in using that same credential here. And you can see that I can now log in into the same environment. So even though these two web pages are being hosted on the same app service plan, they are really two different environments connecting to different databases. So this concludes the task that we set out, and I'm 3 minutes before 8:30 p.m., so I'm satisfied. What we have learned from 7 p.m. till 8:30 p.m. is basically an end-to-end process of creating a new project, checking the code into Azure DevOps repository, building a pipeline, building a build pipeline that builds your code and compile your code, that creates an artifact. That artifact is then used to configure a release pipeline. And in the case of my demo, the release pipeline, there are 3 stages: dev, UAT, and production. And so we deployed code into dev, where we encountered some connection issues with database. And that is very unique on-prem situation where I have not configured the certificate for login. I have a feeling it's just a configuration. If I just disable the certificate check, that should go ahead fine. So dev environment, but we absolutely saw that the connection string was updated to use our on-premises database, even though our code base has a different connection string. And then we configured UAT and production. For both UAT and production, we have a VM level, so it's an IaaS-based deployment, as well as a web app level, which is a PaaS deployment. And in both cases, we were able to modify the connection string. And so the connection to the database was changed, one for UAT and one for production. At the end of the day, I have 3 almost fully working environments. And this is to simulate the most basic kind of environments and pipelines that you will deal with in an enterprise setup. So with that, I conclude my session. I will now pass the time back to Chun Lin and Marvin. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the long session.
It's really long. I'm so sorry for that.
No problem actually. It's very, very informative because just now I was talking to Marvin about there are a lot of things that we can learn from here. Actually, we can apply in our real work as well.
Sure hope so.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for those who stay with us, thank you for spending your night with us also. So we start with delay pass first session about migration. Then after Stephen gave us a 2 session on IaaS. Then I think next month delay pass is coming back to be our speaker again. Hopefully I can grab him to be talking with us. So yeah, without I think Stephen haven't had dinner, and some of you also haven't had dinner because we started quite early. So sorry again for the technical issue in the beginning. So hopefully next time I will do a rehearsal first. So thank you again. So good night to all of you. I will, if you have any comment, please leave in the YouTube. I will try to read it. That's all. So see you in August.
See you, everybody.
Please join us next time.
Yeah, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Oh.